Good morning, everyone. This is the Rates and Lanes podcast. We're saying good morning because we're pre-recording once again. Going to have a very special guest with us. We get ready to just outright offer him a full-time gig on the show and just have him just come on every show probably or something. I don't know if we can twist his arm enough to do that. But our good friend from DAT, Dean Croke, is going to be joining us today. And with that being said, and we don't want to belabor the point because we are pre-recording and we want to honor everyone's time that's here with us. Let's go ahead and get the show rolling. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome in my co-host. Good morning, Chuck. How are you?
We're doing great, Rico. I'm really excited to have Dean Croke on today because there's a guy that knows what's going on and knows what's coming up ahead. So our listeners can get a handle on what's going on.
Absolutely. Very pertinent to get Dean on, and I'm going to bring him on here in just a second. I got one more quick housekeeping matter that we need to take care of before we get started. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please like, share, and subscribe to the video. It helps us get out to the broader algorithm, into the YouTube verse and all that good stuff. So if you would do us that huge favor. Also, if you know anyone that may benefit or find this content that we're trying to put out there entertaining or useful at all, by any means, please share the video with them. We greatly appreciate you for doing so. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and welcome our resident. We're going to call him our resident analyst from DAT. They let us borrow him for a little while. So let's bring on Dean. Good morning, Dean. How are you?
Great to be with you. I'm happy to join the show anytime. I always love getting a text from you guys to say, can you join the show?
Right.
It's always great to have you, Dean.
Yeah, so Chuck, the most important thing is, are you the new owner of an R600 or not?
Well, we haven't decided yet because the guy and I are a few $1,000s apart. And a guy called me, a fellow I spoke to the other day, back in January, and he called me the other day, and he's got a collection. He's going to sell 3 trucks out of his collection. Right. He's got a B model, totally restored. Unfortunately, it's got single Rico like this, but it's got super singles on the back. Just doesn't go with a B model. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry. It just doesn't look right. He's got a Ford. I guess it's a late 80s Ford L model, all done up. And he's got a single axle Pete. Conventional, all done up, an older one. So I'm going to next week, hopefully, or the week after, to look at them.
Right.
But I still like that R model.
This is sort of a separate subject, but I rejoined Facebook in the last 2 weeks and to connect with a lot of my old friends from Australia and my father's trucking history. So I started posting a bunch of trucks from my father's era when I had my very first job as a diesel mechanic in 1977. He worked for a fuel tanker company called Aztec Bulk Lines, and they had all R600s. Now, the first one he drove was the Flintstone Steel Cab Mac, right? And then he went to an R600, the 237 horsepower Maxi-Dyne, and there was a 300 cool power. But these things are on camelback suspensions. And no air ride seats, no air conditioning, no power steering. And I remember riding with them as a kid and think I was just having the time of my life. But if I got in one now, I don't know what I'd think.
I get it. You know, it's what we get used to, and we're getting soft as people. You know, I get into these old, I've got two old B models and an F model here in a Ford cab over, and I get into any of them to move them. And I really appreciate how strong I must have been when I drove a B model 30 odd years ago.
You know, this is sort of it's sort of a genetics thing. But if you look at it, if you go to Australia and you talk to Australian truck drivers and you look at their physical characteristics and I guess it's the same from the guys here that grew up in the sort of what we call the Armstrong steering box days, right? the guys of my father's generation were just mountainous men with these bare hands but longer arms, right? So in our family, we have freakishly long arms. And my wingspan is well over 6 feet, like my reach.
Right.
And my uncle's like that. My father was like that. And I have a theory that it's got to do with all the days of flatbedding, tying down loads of wool and spuds with ropes and
Yep.
chains, and just all that lifting and physical work you did. I think it had a genetic impact on our physical makeup.
I'm sure.
That's my
I'm
theory.
sure.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I wouldn't want to get into a boxing match with anybody in the Croke family. This is interesting. It's a little bit off topic for what we're talking about today, but trucking history. I'd spent an afternoon fishing with one of the executives from PACCAR years ago, and he was telling me that the long nose, which became the 357 and 379, and the Kenworth W9 and all those, they were invented 100 years ago. Just almost 100 years ago, for the boys coming off the farms.
Really?
And these guys' kids hadn't eaten in a decade. They hadn't had a proper meal because there was no money in America on the farms because of the Dust Bowl. And they built these trucks with great big steering wheels because these guys did not have upper body strength.
Wow.
And that's where these trucks come from. They're archaic, but they're pretty good looking to look at, as you know.
My first job driving with my dad was in a 1418 Mercedes-Benz and I was 9 years old, right? And it was a 1968 Mercedes-Benz 1418, 205 horsepower. But in 1969, it had a 5-speed synchromesh gearbox with a 2-speed rear axle and power steering in 1969. And for a young boy, it was dead easy to drive. I couldn't drive the other trucks we had in the yard as a boy, but the Mercedes-Benz, all I needed was a pillow, and I was off. Like I had to hide the keys.
So by the time you were 21 years old, you had well over a decade of trucking under your belt.
I've done thousands of miles. I learned how to back by unloading all of the sheep and cattle trucks at Homebush Meatworks in Sydney. For those that ever watched the Sydney Olympics in 2000, the Olympic Stadium where the Olympic ceremonies were held is on top of where the old Sydney abattoirs used to be, the meatworks used to be. And I used to back everyone's trucks in at night and unload them with my dog. And they'd all go and drink coffee, and I'd unload 10, 12 trucks with 3 decks of sheep on or 2 decks of cattle. And that was and then we'd go home and I'd go to school the next day and people would say for news, like you'd put your hand up as a young kid, well, what have you got for news? And I'd tell these stories and they used to think I was the biggest liar on the planet. It was so funny. That's a lifetime of trucking, right? That's what it does to you. It's hard to get it out of the system.
There's no sector like this one. It is so phenomenal. It's that's why I'm so passionate about it still. It's just it teaches you so many things.
I posted a picture last night of an LTL 9000 I drove in Australia. And I don't know how many days it had been without sleep, but somehow in between loads and no sleep, I still managed to tire black the tires and polish the aluminum rims. and this is on
the pills we used to take because they would make you want to clean everything. I remember them well.
God, like people said, what were you doing shining your tires in the middle of the day? And I couldn't tell them why, but
Yes, I remember shining my mirrors in the middle of a snowstorm in northwestern Ontario.
Yeah, but it's a lot different than today, right? We've got a very different freight market. We've got different drivers, different trucks. Everything's changed. So you can never, I hear a lot of people say, well, bring back the old days. I'm not sure we want to do that.
No,
when it comes to the equipment, you're definitely right about that.
Yeah.
So Dean.
Yeah.
Man, what is going on out here in the spot market?
Jason Miller did a post a little while ago and he said the freight market is, in quotes, blah, B-L-A-H. And I thought, wow, that really sums up what we're going through because my analogy was the slack tide. the in between the high tide and the low tide, right? It's that slack tide where not much is happening. There's no movement either direction, and that's kind of what we've got right now. I was in Indianapolis yesterday speaking for KSM Advisors, who's a big consulting firm for a lot of truckload carriers, and I said to them that this market is kind of drifting sideways, right? There's no up or down. It's very flat. Rates are. And normally when you've got a flat market like this, you see capacity exit a little bit faster. It's not because of what happened a few years ago. We've covered it a lot on the show. There's a lot of carriers out there that have pretty good debt to equity ratios, paid off a lot of their debt during the pandemic, and can afford to run for a bit lower rate per mile now. One of the things, Rico, is I think we've got very soft demand, but what we've got is a lot more owner-operators who own a lot more of their equipment. And it's really, and again, this is anecdotal, right? But I spend a lot of my time in truck stops talking to truckers, and especially on social media through my various channels, finding out what's really going on. Because, and I said to Bill Cassidy in Journal of Commerce, capacity is not leaving because it doesn't have to. And what I meant by that was, I think carriers have much lower operating costs. So that's different to operating costs have gone up. Yes, they've gone up. But in terms of what it really costs you to run per mile, I think there's a lot more profitability than people let on. And I said something, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because it feels like when I talk to owner operators, which is keeping more capacity in the market, right, which is why rates are sort of going down and maybe sideways. The reason they've done this is, and I use the example of the Landstar BCO model, the Landstar Beneficial Capacity Owner, the BCO. And the Landstar BCO, that's one of the very few, if not the only, non-forced dispatch businesses where you know who they are. They own their own equipment. The cream of the crop, operate when they need to, 8 months on, 4 months off, 3 on, 3 off, whatever. Yep. They come and go into the market when the getting's good, and when it's not, we'll park up. So what it seems like is that a lot more independent contractors have become like Landstar BCOs in their behavior, more selective. They sit for longer, they run for a much lower rate per mile than they would normally, but they're still making money. But it's because they don't carry the debt levels they did beforehand. And I've spoke to dozens of drivers who have done this. They've got a lot more flexibility. They can pick and choose the lanes. They can pick and choose the rates. And there's all this sort of latent capacity sitting in the market because they did so well years ago. Now, at some point, the money runs out. Of course. Right? So, but right now, people say, well, why hasn't capacity left the market? Well, it's because I think more carriers than we could ever imagine made so much money during 2021, 2022, and we also had a doubling of capacity during that period.
That's a big thing.
Yep. And by my calculations, when I study the number of authorities that have come in and the number of authorities that have left in the last 2 years, we still have 20% of that new capacity in the market. 20% of the carrier authorities. That's not the number of trucks.
Right.
But to put that into perspective, of all the new carrier authorities that came into the industry during the pandemic, about 75% of them were owner-operators, and close to 85% joined the DAT spot market load board. Right.
What percentage of that?
About 85% of the new capacity that came in became DAT customers. So wow. a lot of the new so Rico, nearly 95% of all of the new authorities have less than 3 trucks. Mm-hmm. This is where all the growth has been. Now, people, and the FMC data doesn't tell you, is it a class 8 truck or a class 6? Is it a 10?
Right.
But if they're hitting DAT's load board and looking for 53-foot van loads,
right,
there's a pretty good, connection between new capacity entering the spot market. So it's a really good proxy for interstate, for hire, long distance truckload capacity, which there is a lot of in the market right now at a time when demand is soft. And that's why when carriers say, don't haul cheap freight, well, to some of these guys, it's not cheap. It's actually a really good rate because they have very low operating costs.
Yeah, it all depends on if you paid $250,000 for your Freightliner, you need more money per mile that no one is going to give you as compared to if you paid $30,000 for that Freightliner. You can operate for a lot less. The other thing I think, Dean, and we talked about this last week with a friend who's involved in used trucks, is when we hear about these bankruptcies and insolvencies, the trucks aren't leaving the system. It's new people buying them. So the trucks aren't going anywhere. It's just different players who are buying, where somebody went out and spent, during the pandemic. Now I'm up in Canada, so our pricing is a little bit different. But when somebody went and spent $250,000 for a Cascadia 2.5 years ago, and today that truck is worth $60,000, $50,000.
Right.
The second guy grabbing that truck has a much better chance of success.
Well, Chuck, used truck prices, according to ACT Research, are down 20% year over year. So the truck that was, excuse me for looking away from the camera, but in the middle of 2022, this Class 8 sleeper cab truck, and these are 3 to 5 year old trucks on the market, was $92,000. Today it's 60, right? So this is so it gives you an idea how much that dropped. They're sitting at about, they're still higher than what they were in 2018, which was the last sort of up cycle in used prices. So what you've got though, so on the other side of the equation, you've got a lot of large truckload carriers dumping trucks into the market, used truck market. So used truck prices are coming down because there's a lot of used trucks hitting the market.
Right.
So the auction volume was up 16% in March. I mean, this is an interesting data point. The auction volume is up 55% year over year.
Wow.
So the number of trucks going to auction. Now, those auction trucks are both loan defaults, right, for a lot of those trucks, right? And there's an ongoing trade activity as new trucks come in, the fleets. So what the large truckload carriers are doing, they're trying to regulate, modulate is the right word, I think, their capacity down to where demand is. So we're not hiring as many drivers. We're slow rolling the driver hiring. We're parking trucks. We're getting rid of our aged assets, our inventory, and we're still bringing new trucks into the market, right, ready for the next upturn. So you're seeing this wave of trades hit the retail truck market, which is driving used truck prices down, which is opening the door for carriers to join the market again.
Right.
Now, so the data point that supports that is for every 10 that leave the spot market, 8 join.
We just got a churn going
every single month.
And nothing is going to change. All of a sudden, we're not going to wake up one day unless it's something, a rail strike or something like this, which is they're talking about one up in Canada, which would really help the Canadian boys. Temporarily, but all it is, it's a Band-Aid at best. They're going to get a little bit of, they'll have a really, really good couple weeks, maybe even a good month, but that'll be about it. And of course, the capacity is there's so much capacity up here. Matter of fact, I got a call from an old friend of mine from years ago who runs about 150 trucks. He called me last week, knowing that I'm not really in the business anymore, saying, can you help me? Do you know where I can get some outbound? There's a guy with 150 trucks. And so everybody's feeling it from the biggest to the smallest. I know that the one truck operators are feeling it, and so are the big guys.
So the excess capacity is still hasn't adjusted to equilibrium, right? So all this capacity, we've still got. So the theory is capacity will exit, and you'll get closer, so loads equals trucks, or capacity is going to hang in there for a long time until demand picks up. Now, in that scenario, which is kind of a worst case scenario for a lot of us because it means more of the same, this kind of benign blah freight market. And why I think that's a high probability is large truckload carriers, when we measure the number of trucks from their earnings calls in the first quarter on the Journal of Commerce Truckload Carrier Index, which is an index of the average number of large public companies' trucks on the road, their number of trucks on the road is down 15% in the last year. Right. So to put some numbers around that, if they had 93,000 trucks on the road during the peak of the pandemic, they've got 79,000 now. So the large carriers have got rid of a lot of capacity on the road. It's still decreasing. For 5 quarters, they've been decreasing their fleet size on the large carrier side. Now, how that's translating into rates on the contract side of the market, which is like 84% of the loads moved last month, the new rates coming into routing guides based on recent RFPs. So these are incumbent carriers. They're top of the routing guide, and they've gone to their shipper and renegotiated their rates. The new rates coming into routing guides last week were 1.2% lower than the rates they're replacing.
Yeah.
So there's still, so new rates are still dropping for contract freight.
Oh yeah.
And at this conference yesterday, when I said that, one of the ladies stood up and she asked the question, and they've got a fairly large fleet, and she said, we're seeing triple that number. We are having to drop our contract rates on RFPs triple what that is. So in that 3 to 5% range to hold the volume.
Yeah.
So there's still, shippers still have pricing power. So they're still driving down the contract rate because capacity is still, very soft. And there's plenty of trucks out there, to your point about looking for loads, that big carrier looking for outbound loads. There's still a lot of capacity sitting there that's looking for freight to move. And that's keeping a lid on any particular inflection point in the market. Because that's what we're looking for, is what's the inflection point. And there's nothing that sort of says we'll see an inflection point anytime soon because of this latent capacity. This, I'll call it dark capacity.
Right.
Because it can afford to sit and be opportunistic. And again, in my time, and again, I've only got 24 years experience in studying this country's freight market, but in my 24 years here, I've not seen such a wide spread in operating costs from the person that owns their own truck and trailer at $1.50 a mile because they paid off all of their debt, to a brand new carrier that paid triple for a used truck at the end of 2022, who needs $2.12 a mile to break even, just to break even. So this,
sure. I got a couple of different things I want to throw at you, Dean. When we talk about, and I'm one of those people, all of my equipment is paid for. I don't necessarily have any debt on any equipment. However, there still has to be some type of balance that has to be stricken between operating costs and things of that nature. So you still have to have making sure that you are charging enough to be able to not only to cover replacement costs, and also on top of that, even though your equipment and everything may be paid off, but I don't know of any repair shop that's going down on the hourly rates or anything like that, and parts and part costs is going through the roof as well. So
yeah, I agree.
I think that there's still a fine balance that even though you may have people that have paid off equipment, you still there's still some type of balance or equilibrium that has to be struck between balancing and operating at efficiently, I should say.
Well, so it's a short-term path to going out of the business if you're not getting a return on your equity, if you're not getting the right rate. So, you can only do that for a short period of time, right? You can only set, that's why my point is the money will run out eventually if you keep doing that. But we're at the bottom of the freight market where everyone's margins are compressed. Broker margins are getting crushed. Carrier margins are getting crushed. And it's the bottom of the cycle here where it's the hardest, where people can, if they can get by, there's an upswing coming. The problem is with all of these carriers that can afford to get, to sort of skate along on thin ice, to use that analogy, they can do that for a little bit longer, but eventually it does run out, because even, Rico, in great times, even if you're getting good money and you're not generating sufficient profit, if you're not getting a return on the equity in your truck, a lot of people don't understand what the return on equity means. It means if you can get 3% in the bank for that 100,000 you got in your truck, you got to get 3% in your rates or more, and otherwise you end up trading down. You can't trade up. You're always buying a lesser quality truck over the years, and that's one of the biggest mistakes I see carriers make. Is exactly the point you make, which is not getting a sufficient return on capital to generate enough profit for the inevitable in-frame rebuild, and enough money to put away to buy a newer truck down the road or upgrade your reefer motor or whatever it is you've got to do. That's where we kind of go wrong. So even though average operating costs are like $1.85 a mile, the reality is you probably need north of $2.50 a mile as a rate to actually be profitable.
Of course, because your expenses are so high. And the other thing that happened, I think, during the pandemic, when we had all these this influx of new carriers, a lot of those new carriers were truck drivers that saw an opportunity to get into the game against Rico and my advice. And they got into it, and rates were insane. We never saw rates like that in our lives.
Right.
But now that the party is over, and these people had no money, so they got into the business using factoring. Okay, and I'm not going to sit here and say anything bad about factoring because it's got its place. But I've always said you cannot replace the money you need, your seed money to start your business, with a factoring company because it's too expensive.
Right.
So when you're talking about a 3% return, but your factoring cost alone is 2 or 3%, why are you waking up in the morning? Go stay in bed.
Well, they're the opportunistic carriers that came in, bought a used truck, put the sign on the side of their truck crooked. Like,
oh yeah.
Poor Rico's almost choked on his water. But nothing drives me nuts more than a crooked sign on the side of the truck. Have some pride. Like, come on. Who puts signs on crooked? Or worse, what workshop is putting odd mud flaps on the back of trailers? Like, stop this.
Yeah.
Anyway, so those guys came in.
Somebody loses a mud flap. Somebody loses a mud flap, and they go to the truck stop, and they don't have a lot of money, and they go, you know what? What have you got? You got to use mud flap to put it on, make me legal. I've seen it.
I remember during the pandemic, I'm passing guys, and they've got the big texter out, and they've written their DOT number and their name, and I'm thinking, how long are you planning to be in business? Like, what is this? And of course, they came and they went. And these guys were hauling empty trailers, respotting empty trailers cross country for thousands of dollars just to move an empty trailer. So the times were good. And of course, that's unprecedented, but it's created this shift in the market that is still reverberating around today. And that's the thing that we're all trying to grapple with, is how much has changed, and is this the new normal? Like, is this now just how things are going to be? I don't know.
It sounds like the intro to an old mobster movie. It was the best of times and the worst of times.
The only thing there's only two things that are going to fix this. Number one, and some world event where all of a sudden things change, like another pandemic, God forbid, because that was hell. For a lot of people. A lot of people lost their life savings, lost their businesses, equilibriums were thrown off. Or finding a market for all these North American trucks to get them the hell out of here. Because every time Ritchie Brothers has a sale and there's bargains and people are buying those trucks and putting them back to work, we're just we're continuing the problem. We got to get the trucks gone off this continent, create a little bit less capacity, or a lot less capacity, then the prices will go up. And I have to remind everybody, everybody blames freight brokers for the market conditions. The market sets the price, not the freight brokers. Freight brokers are no less. Real estate brokers don't set the price of houses. The market sets the price. It's the same thing.
Right. Can we put that on some sort of a banner on the side of the road that DAT doesn't set rates? We don't own it.
No, you're a conduit. You're basically a modern version of a telephone service for trucking. That's really what you are. How do no more than Bell Telephone makes bad news for people because somebody calls and says, you know what, your Aunt Rose passed away this morning. You can't get mad at the telephone company.
Well, it's symptomatic. Sorry, Rico, go on.
No, you go ahead.
Well, it's symptomatic of how a lot of people think in trucking, which is, we kind of take on this victim mentality that our lot in life is because of someone else's doing. And the reality is that you're exactly where you are because you chose to be. As harsh a statement as that is, you've got to accept that all of your decisions through your life have landed you where you are right now. And of course, some of us have pretty bad luck and we have bad health and all those sorts of things. I'm not discounting the impact of those, but from a business perspective, the decisions you make have shaped where we land today. and that's where I see some of the biggest weaknesses is, carriers are very quick to blame someone else for, lack of knowledge of what it costs to operate a truck, what the market's doing, demand for what they haul, all those sorts of things go into it. And of course, blaming cheap rates or other carriers is an easy way out. The reality is that to change that, they're much harder decisions. Like, am I going to change my equipment type, my market? Am I going to do something different? I'm going to, sell my flatbed and get a drop deck or an RGN. Like, what am I going to do differently to change my outlook? Sometimes people lack the capital to even make that change. So we tend to be very introspective. We criticize within our own industry a lot, rather than, I think, taking charge of our own lot in life and making it happen. That's the sort of
You're 100% right. And I think a lot of times carriers don't want to know the truth of what they're doing to their own business by making dumb decisions.
Right.
Not changing. Where you have a truck that's getting 5 miles per gallon, get rid of the damn thing and get something that's going to get 8 miles per gallon, because there's a huge savings there.
Or Chuck, if you make a bad decision, cut and run. Like, don't linger. Like, get going. I always use the analogy with my boys. It's much easier. Like steering a parked car is very difficult, but if you get it moving, it's much easier.
Right.
And what I say to folks is just get the car moving, and you can course correct along the way, but don't sit there doing nothing. That's the worst thing you can do, because as we've found, and me meeting you two, is because of moving forward. And because when you move forward, opportunity knocks and it's easy to open the door. But if you're sitting around belly aching, like, no one's knocking. That's
right. Exactly. I always say success is when preparation and opportunity collide. That's success. Well, you're not going to get, you're not going to find success unless you're out there hustling.
Right.
No matter what, you've got to hustle.
One of the things that I was, talking about with some friends in Australia was I was doing interstate work, hauling steel, flatbed work, steel, double tarping, chain straps, multi-drop, pick, drop loads, and then overnighting back with air freight the next night on a flatbed with gates and a 6-foot drop cap tarp. And like, that is hard work. But the transition I made out of trucking was, in between loads, I took my suit and tie, went for a job interview, drove the truck into the transport company for a management job. And the CEO said, "How did you get here?" And I said, "That's my truck outside." He said, "You're hired." and that,
excuse me,
that was my transition out, because if you're prepared to do what other people won't do, and that's sort of the freight mix I've always focused on, is I'm going to haul all the ugly stuff no one else wants to touch. It's about finding a niche and finding that seam. It's like running through the gap in a football game as opposed to at the people. Like, I always look for the seam in any market, and that's where I think carriers find opportunity.
That you're 100% right. You've got to you can't be like, everybody looks for the low-hanging fruit, which is the spot market. Okay.
Right.
I think you need to forget about the spot market. It is dead. And I don't know whether I've said this to you before, Dean, but Rico's heard it 100 times. Right now, the spot market is a river with one fish in it and 600 fishermen standing, at the banks of the river, and with nets, and somebody else fish, and 600 people jump into the river trying to net that fish.
Right.
Well, speaking on the spot market and the 600 fishermen, Dean, right now with produce cycle kind of being, getting rolling pretty good there, what are we looking like? Because of course, the cyclical matter of when produce season starts, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dean, it's just my thought, but I think that when the produce season starts, I think it starts to balance out the different types of dry vans, and kind of gets everybody operating fully in their own particular segment.
Yep.
And we kind of get a little bit more closer to what a actual reality looks like when it comes to the market. So Well, since we got you, let's see what we got. What's going on right now?
Right. So produce season has started. The official starting line is Vidalia onion pack date in your part of the world, Rico, in the 13 counties that grow the Vidalia onion. That's the official start of produce season. Of course, you've already had blueberries and strawberries pumping out of Florida. You've had Mother's Day, big lift, really tight capacity in the 2 weeks heading up to Mother's Day. Like rates went through the roof northbound for reefers in those 2 weeks, but of course they dropped right off around Mother's Day. So we saw a bit of a lift there, Rico, but not enough to move the national needle.
Wow.
Right. So, but produce volumes are still tracking about 3% behind last year. But remember, last year is not a good year because we had a lot of wet weather on the West Coast that slowed the season. So go back to prior years, we're about 3 to 4% lower than 2018 and 19 produce volumes. So we're still tracking.
We're still behind there.
Still behind right now. A survey came out last week of 1,000 consumers. And last year, they were spending 40% of their household budget on food and restaurants. This year, it's 30%. So we're spending less on food. We're buying different cuts of meat. We're buying lower cost items. There's less demand for food. Food is the biggest part of truckload demand in the country. It's about 15% of Jason Miller's truckload ton mile index, which is about 1% behind this time last year. So
wow.
So demand, it just came out yesterday. The TTMI is sitting slightly above thereabouts 2018 levels in terms of tonnage, right? But it's down about 1% compared to this time last year. To your point, Rico, at a time when it's normally up. So Jason Miller's comment on his LinkedIn post was very telling. He said it's down about 1% month over month, but his seasonal adjusting algorithm expected a 2.8% increase in March. So whereas seasonally it would normally go up 2.8%, it went down 1%. So that sort of speaks to how soft the freight market is based on some of the commodities that we're hauling. Produce season nationally from the USDA website, and I'll just quickly look at it, down 3% year over year as of last week. California's up 13%. Now, California produced 7,000 truckloads last week, Florida 4,300, Washington State 3,300. So what you're looking for is California to be up around 45, 50% of the national volume. We're not there yet, but that will happen. We will get there. But I think what will pull, even though California is going to be very strong, Rico, I think soft demand in all the other markets will kind of bring down the national volume.
Down.
Right. That's why our short-term rates, this is sort of answer your question specifically, we are projecting about a 10-cent per mile lift in reefer rates through July 4. Normally, it's about 25 cents.
Right.
So there is a produce season lift in both dry van and reefer because the market tightens as that volume comes in, and reefer carriers in the dry market go over to the reefer market. Capacity tightens. There is a lift, but nowhere near what you'd say in a normal season, which gets to where we started the show. There's a lot of excess capacity in the market. But the challenge with reefers is, and you'd know this, Rico, you've got to really know your stuff, hauling products. And you've got to have a pretty new reefer motor. And we've got a lot of brokers that you can't haul for if it's 3 years or older. So, if you're hauling...
really?
Yeah, if you're hauling cherries out of Lodi, California, you've got to have pretty new gear. And
as soon as berries, you're not going to get a load of berries unless you've got a new reefer. It's too, and that's what happened before. You had these smaller carriers that had older gear. They would cook a load of berries, they'd be out of business. First load.
Well, that's why when you go out and sit in Salinas or Watsonville outside Driscoll's and you watch the equipment rolling out of there, there's some pretty slick trucks. I mean, even Cascadias and H&L Volvos, like they've got a bit of stainless and spread axle reefers.
Yeah,
they're cracking. So I think it's about viability. And people say, well, why hasn't capacity? Why isn't there more capacity in certain sectors? Well, you've got to be fairly specialized in the reefer market to get in and stay in. And it's a bit like flatbed. You got to really know your stuff to be a flatbedder. Whereas I think a lot of this extra capacity that's sort of lulling around the market is mostly dry van, because that's where all the growth was in the market.
Because that's, dry vans is again, that's the low hanging fruit.
Right. It's where it's the lowest common denominator, right? Because
right. You can get, you can go buy a used dry van for $6,000 or $7,000. It's not a beautiful trailer, but it's functional. It does the same thing that a brand new one does, except there are some it's going back now where some shippers are refusing to load older equipment again.
Right. Well, our reefer rate nationally is, this might help Rico answer his question a little bit more. Reefer rates nationally are sitting at $1.91. That's for all, so that's all temps. That's frozen, produce, everything, $1.91. That's excluding fuel.
That's not including fuel, yeah.
That's line haul. Whereas on the USDA website, the national line haul rate all in is 206. Right, so they're pulling about 15
all
cents.
In that including the fuel.
Yeah, that's everything. That's everything to move it. So that's the spot rate.
206.
That's the average in the USDA produce market.
Going to get rich quick on that one, eh, Rico?
Now, out of California, it's 214 a mile, but that'll go way higher than that as we get into produce season. So I think when your national average looks pretty bad, but I think some of those lanes though are going to start to run pretty hot once we get more volume. So I think, Rico, I wouldn't look at the national rates and draw too much from it, because most freight moves regionally. I mean, you know that. I think that's where there's going to be a lot of opportunity regionally for carriers that are in the right spot at the right time for peak season. If they're in Tifton or out, somewhere in Georgia, I think there's going to be a lot of activity in the specialized part of our business. If I'm in a reefer market, or I've got a drop deck with ramps, or an RGN, or if I'm kind of specialized in some way, right, I think they're going to do really well this year, because I think the excess capacity is not in those specialized sectors. I mean, there's still plenty of trucks out there, don't get me wrong, but I just think that's where you'll be able to survive a little bit better.
So right now, Florida's kind of cooling off, it sounds like, in the produce market, as far as on the eastern part, it's starting to move up a little further north.
Yeah, it is, especially off the West Coast, right? So don't forget that this is road check week on the West Coast. There's only 2 roads out for produce, 80 and 40, and maybe 15 if you want to sneak up through Salt Lake City. But the authorities have those 2 roads pretty well tied down. So capacity tightens. They add about 24 hours to transit time off the West Coast for produce. So rates will tighten this week out of there. But if I look, just to give you an idea where rates are forecast to go, out of Salinas, if I'm loading iceberg lettuce out of Salinas, I'm getting $222 a mile today, plus fuel. So my all-in rate would be $269. So we're pulling $279 out of Salinas today to New York, to Hunts Point.
Right.
And this time last year, it peaked at $273. So the peak is June out of Salinas, and it's at $273 now. It's at $269, so it's about where it was last year. And let me go out to the 52-week forecast, and it has rates. We get to November, rates are going to be at about $245, and they're going to forecast to be a little bit lower this time next year. So there is. So I think what I'm trying to describe here is, if you could see a line chart, there's this seasonality on all of the lanes, and that's what you got to watch for. I wouldn't, I'm sort of discrediting my own work here, but I wouldn't pay much attention to the national average, because
it's skewed. Yeah,
no one's home at the national average. An average is made up of highs and lows.
Right, highs and lows. Right,
and I think that's where you've got to focus. Some of the highs, I think, will be, that's why I say to carriers, what should I look at? Well, look at festival season. I produce a festival calendar throughout the year, because why do they have produce festivals? Because that's the timing of their peak harvest.
Right.
So following the festivals, that's where the getting's good. So it's pretty simple. And but I know that sounds simple, but I know from sitting in the seat of a truck, it's hard to get that intel into a distillable format where you can look at it and say, that's where I need to be in June or July. But so
does the problem is, Dean, so does everybody else. Like you were talking about the huge bump a couple of weeks ago in Florida.
You couldn't get a load to Florida.
They produce. Try getting a load to Florida. And I know that when I was working, we had customers that gave us loads every week going to Florida, except when Florida would open up, and then they would give it to other carriers for a fraction. I mean, that these guys were running down to Florida for 80 cents a mile, stealing our work for that period of time. Then the customer's going, well, I got more loads for Florida for you. Well, it's also July, you idiot. Of course you want to give me your Florida. Where were you in May?
Well, I'm just going to pull up Atlanta, Miami, because that's exactly what I saw in the 2 weeks ahead of Mother's Day. Was rates started to tank. Atlanta Lakeland, in particular, a high volume reefer lane. In fact, Atlanta Lakeland is our biggest spot market reefer lane in the country.
Wow.
The volume is staggering. It's, of course, it's Orlando, right? So it's a distribution market. But if I look at rates there, they took a belting going down there. They're starting to come back up a little bit now. But everybody was dying to get into Miami. I'm not sure I'd be wanting to haul 2,500 boxes of floor-loaded flowers with unloading at docks with no warehouses. I think you keep that.
Basically, you're going to floral wholesalers and in some weird market or flower shops even.
So that's why Prime Inc. put a 10% surcharge on all their loads. They publish it on their website for all those, and they have cut-off dates every day for the capacity. They put a 20% surcharge on Los Angeles loads this Mother's Day. So there's opportunistic, there's opportunity in the market if you know where to look. But the problem is you suffer on that inbound, right? Because everybody's sort of looking to get into those, and that's the same with Yakima Valley and the Pacific Northwest. You'll see a lot of carriers, they'll drop their rates into Seattle, which goes against, it's counterintuitive. But if they can get, run deadhead across the mountain there and then load south back to Los Angeles, the rate per mile is pretty good on the round trip. So we see a lot of those balanced markets behave like that, where they're, in flatbed, Dallas, Houston is our busiest flatbed lane. But those two lanes work opposite each other. If one goes up, the other goes down. So the round trip rate is always sitting at around 220 a mile. So it's a very dynamic market, but it always works in tandem. That's sort of the thing to watch.
Yeah, it's a pretty big lane.
I'm looking at the time, and we gotta get ready to let Dean get up out of here because he has another prior engagement that he has to get to. But before we let you go, Dean, if you would let us know, let good people know where they can find your work and any other information where they can find you at on social media if they want to kind of catch up with you and follow along. And see what you got going on. So
we publish all of this information every week on our live DATIQ show, DAT Freight and Analytics on YouTube or LinkedIn Live every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern. If you've got any questions about any of the data, you can write to askiq@dat.com, askiq@dat.com. And I'm on all the social media channels, on LinkedIn, fairly active on LinkedIn, and of course at the Grumpy Pete on Facebook, Instagram, and social media, and TikTok, the last one on social media.
All right, Dean. Well, we are grateful for you taking to spend a little bit of time with us and kind of helping us break down some of these numbers and what's going on the spot market. And I tell you, there's probably no better resource out there than yourself, and we definitely appreciate you taking the time to come on and join us.
Thank you, guys. Love being on with you.
Appreciate it again, Dean.
Thank you so much.
We'll let you go ahead. We don't want you to miss your flight.
Not because of us, anyways.
All right. We'll see you guys.
Again, Dean.
Thanks.
We'll talk at you soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care. Be safe.
I'll tell you what, Chuck. It's this whole thing with the spot market and everything. It's really wild. It's fascinating as well. And I'm kind of like, as you know, I'm kind of in the thick of it. So right now at the moment, and it's definitely been a little bit of a trying. It's been a new experience since I've been operating in the spot market. But I'm kind of enjoying it a little bit. but I tell you, I'm ready to get the hell out of it. I tell you that.
Because it's, you know what, Dean, it almost doesn't it really doesn't exist for the most part.
Right.
It's not there. It's first of all, we always have to remember that brokers do not want to put their loads on the spot market, on the board. They want to call the good brokers, especially, but even the worst broker. Nobody wants to. They want to have a go-to guy. Oh, there's my guy Rico. He does, he runs North Carolina. You call him. So
it definitely
especially in
helps to
this
have
market.
those relationships in
What
any
is
in
ending
any
up,
market.
Rico, when there's no freight, what freight is ending up on the spot board? You know, it's usually it's an emergency
The
or
stuff
somebody
nobody wants to do.
yeah, somebody that doesn't pay their bills or there's something usually, because
Yeah.
why is it there?
Yeah. Because like I say, those having those relationships, even if you are running the spot market, even if your customer base is 100% brokers, having those relationships will definitely help insulate you a little bit more so than just running off of the board per se.
Yeah, you can't, you know what, you really, and we've been preaching this all along, but now more than ever, pick your lane. I know that we had, last week when I was in North Carolina, I was talking to one of our listeners, our longtime listeners. I was actually supposed to meet up with him and break bread together. And he was too busy and it all worked out fine. But he was telling me he's running 100 miles within home. That's all he does. And he's averaging $500 for he's averaging $5 a mile, but he only goes 100 miles from home.
Right.
Okay. And I think those are the, you know, if you're just running a dry van, I think those are the opportunities that are out there. Obviously, if you've got specialized equipment, whether it's refrigerated or open deck equipment, there are other opportunities. But I don't necessarily know if the opportunities are running the coast to coast work anymore.
Right. I think that's kind of unless you really got that market kind of keyed in on that market. That's a really tough one to that's a tough cat to skin right now.
Well, and we just heard from our good friend Dean Croke that, you know, the freight rate coming out of California, the reefer rate going into Hunts Point was quite high. But my question is, what are they getting back to California? You know, if they're getting $1.25 or $1.50, that takes their good $2 plus rate per mile and it puts it right down the drain.
Right.
You've got to, yeah, it's great. It's like, you know, somebody's willing to give you $3 a mile to go to Miami in the middle of July. You got to be prepared. You've got 500 miles anyways dead to get the hell out of Florida.
Right. Yeah, that's something that you always gotta be considering.
Yeah.
So Chuck, I'm looking at the time on our end too. We pushing up close to that 60-minute mark. We want to go ahead and kind of put a bow on this thing for the week.
Okay.
Let everybody know where they can find you.
If I can help any of our listeners with anything at all, please reach out to me, Chuck Snow 280 at outlook.com. And put your phone number on the email. I always call our listeners back as soon as I get the email, and I'll help you with anything I can. I know these are tough times, and I'm always willing to help out our listeners. And with that, Rico, I'll let you back. We're in a hole for another week.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Rates and Lanes podcast. We appreciate your attention and your joining us for this podcast. We definitely are always grateful for you doing so. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you took a little time to hang out with us. And we always appreciate you doing so. And if you, like I said at the beginning, if you find any of this information entertaining or useful at all, or you know someone that it can help out, by all means, please share the podcast, share the show. And with that being said, we want you guys to stay safe out there, stay healthy, keep it in between the mustard and the mayonnaise, and we'll talk at you same time, same place next week. God bless you and good night.
Catch you on the flip flop. Good night. God bless.